My name is Shika. I am the Obesity Program Director at the National Initiative for Children's Healthcare Quality. I am a community health center pediatrician. I'm still a community health center pediatrician as well. And I've done a lot of work around both clinical obesity interventions and then obesity interventions kind of that bridge the clinical and community space, as well as some sort of medical supervision of completely community intervention. So the goal of this talk is really to think about how you keep families engaged. And I think that there are many different ways to do that, and we can talk. I didn't do a lot of slides around innovation. This was really around the nuts and bolts of what hopefully everyone here can do. And so it's meant to be very pragmatic, but again, I want this to be a very dynamic conversation, a very two-way conversation. So if we want to get further into what other people are doing or areas of innovation, we can certainly do that. Okay, and I'm going to state my usual disclaimer, which is that I'm a Mac user, so I always have trouble advancing my slides because this is not Mac. The title of the talk is Engaging Families. They heard you, and then what do they do between visits? Oh, already we're in trouble. Okay. So just to set the stage a little bit, and I'm sure that you all know this in the various settings you work in, but when you work with families, discussing a child's weight status with a family can be a big challenge. And so the one thing to keep in mind, and this seems so obvious, and when I was writing some of these slides, I felt like, maybe they were just really obvious, but I think these are important things to keep in the front of your mind, and sometimes your interactions are so busy or so charged that you lose track of those really important nuggets. So the goal was to kind of bring some of those things back to the center. So the first thing is just removing stigma or laziness or lack of motivation, right? So focusing on health, not weight or appearance, acknowledging the role of the environment in contributing to the obesity epidemic, and then normalizing the challenges associated with change. And again, much easier said than done. And I think the place where this comes up most for me as a clinician is really when I talk to families of tweens or teens, and the parent and the child, or the caregiver and child, have started to separate a little bit in terms of starting to play the blame game. And so, you'll hear the mom say the kid sneaks food, and the kids say, well, she drinks too much soda anyway, and you start to end up in this messy conversation that you're not really sure you're supposed to be present for. And so these are the places where I find it really, really important to say, well, hold on, we're not making changes because we're not lazy or because we don't care or any of those things. It's really to think about everyone, to kind of normalize and say, everyone's thinking about health. We all want this to be better for your whole family. We all want health to be better. That's why I'm here. That's why you all came today. And then starting again. And again, really obvious point, but really easy to lose, especially when they start yelling at each other in a room. So just some messages from We Can. Are you all familiar with what We Can is? It's a curriculum from the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. And the website's down at the bottom. And there are different pieces of this actually throughout this talk. And you'll have access to the slides. So those of you who are scribbling furiously will have access to the slides later. So just a couple of messages that are on their website that I thought were interesting that you could use within your setting, which is, we're an in-the-car and sit-behind-a-desk society. For many of us, parents and children alike, daily life doesn't involve a lot of physical activity. If we want to be active, we have to make an effort. And so, one, this acknowledges the role of the environment. Two, it uses the language of we, so really kind of normalizing the behavior in a different way. And really understanding that it's your job to kind of insert physical activity into a life that isn't already full of physical activity. The second message is food is everywhere, along with messages telling us to eat and drink. We can get something to eat in places where it was never available before, like the gas station, and going out to eat or buying carry-out is really easy. So really just acknowledging that the healthy choice isn't the easy choice, and really empowering families to start to think about the fact that they are essentially on an uphill battle, but that you're there with them. And then the last is that food portions at restaurants and at home are bigger than they used to be, right? So really starting to move the conversation around portion control. So the second piece is, now that you've sort of normalized and sort of started to think about the environmental role, to provide basic education, right? And so the first thing, I know there was a next step session a little bit earlier, and there was supposed to be a motivational interviewing session tomorrow that I think got canceled. So in this, I was hoping to kind of weave in some principles of motivational interviewing, the simplest ones and the ones that I tend to use most often across settings. So the first is just asking permission, right? Is it okay if we talk about your diet and physical activity habits today? Some people choose to use the words weight. Some people don't choose to use the word weight. I think there's a lot of healthy discussion about that. You heard some of that this morning, and I think that tends to be the topic by the coffee station as well, because no one's really sure about how much the naming matters to whom. So to some families it's hugely important, and to some families it's less important. And so just I think being more careful about normalizing and about your body language and your attitude towards it, and then choosing your words as you think are fit for a given family. But asking permission to discuss is really important. It's very empowering for families. So that conversation earlier about self-efficacy for families, I work in an underserved area of Boston, so I deal with a lot of families who they don't drive a lot of their own decisions, right? Their housing is chosen for them. Essentially, their food options are chosen for them because they may receive some federal assistance that comes with certain purchasing power or lack thereof. And so just giving them the choice about what they want to talk about is hugely empowering. So for those of you who have never tried it, I encourage you to try it, with just a few families that you meet with on any given day, and regardless of your setting, if you have any direct contact with families at all. And then provide basic information regarding energy balance, right? So, we talk about calories in, calories out, and it seems really, really obvious. But I don't know that every family that I see really understands that the way, that you gain or lose weight is just this mathematical equation of calories in and calories out. And some of the families I deal with don't really have a great sense of math. So you might have to break this down at a pictorial level, and really understand the in and the out. And then, so again, on they have some really basic ways to cut 150 calories, and this is just sort of the energy in piece. And I think these small concrete examples, which you'll see sort of throughout this talk, are really, really nice for families. They're really understandable. So, drink water instead of a 12-ounce regular soda. So one small thing you could say. Or order a small serving of French fries instead of a medium, or order a salad with dressing on the side instead. Eat an egg white omelet with 3 eggs instead of whole eggs. Use tuna canned in water instead of oil. So again, things that you might have thought of before, but nice tools to have. And then some ways to burn 150 calories energy out in just 30 minutes. So shoot hoops, walk 2 miles, do yard work, gardening, raking leaves, or things like that. Go for a bike ride, or dance with your family or friends. And you might want to modify those based on your setting. I work in an urban setting, so probably for me it's really only shooting hoops, and if you walk 2 miles, it's going to have to be in a very constricted area because it's not that safe, and then maybe dancing with your family or friends. But if you live in a more rural environment, you might have a very different set of choices. Okay. So now you've opened the conversation. How do you start to move the family towards action, right? So if you see that as if you're the tail end of your interaction where you start to really get into this conversation about weight and health, how do you start to move them along? So before the end of a visit, and this is set up as a clinical visit, but really it's meant to be for other types of interaction as well, have them choose between 1 and 3 goals to act on. And no more than 3. Most of my families do better with 1 or 2. I think, when I first started doing obesity visits, I would let the families, they're supposed to be directing the agenda according to motivational interviewing, so I would let them choose whatever goals they wanted. And I'll show you some bubble sheets in the upcoming slides. And so some families would choose 5, and I'd say, well, that's really great. They're really motivated, and they're going to choose 5. And ultimately, they'd come back a month later for their next visit, and I'd ask what happened, and they'd say we basically, didn't do anything, and I'd ask why. And for most of those families, it was completely overwhelming. So they left. They had these 5 big things they were supposed to do. It seemed like turning their whole life upside down, and so they just froze. And just kind of sat on it for another month. So really between 1 and 3. And the family should choose them, but limit the number. And you may need separate goals for the caregiver and the child. So particularly for tweens and teens, I have the adult set a household goal for each goal set by the child or adolescent. That's really helpful when you get into those blame game dynamics, because you say, well, that's great, so, in that example of the mom who says she's always sneaking snacks, then you can have a conversation with the child about whether they're willing to stop sneaking snacks. But then when the kid blames back and says, well, mom, always drinks the soda, then you say, well, okay, so, Sally's changing this. Mom, are you willing to change that? And it actually becomes very effective and can change the dynamic very fast. And then the next point is to consider using a bubble sheet, which I'll show you to just kind of help families choose. So this is just an example, and there are many examples of this in the motivational interviewing in various tools and toolkits. And this one, actually, there's a version of this that's in the Next Steps guide that some of you heard about earlier this morning. These are things that work for other kids. Which of these, if any, are you willing to try? And to really go through these. And I've seen this done with pictures. This is a good one for a slide, but I've done it where all of these things are different pictures. And you really kind of take it out with the family and let the kid choose first. And there's one for parents. That's the next slide. But really thinking about what they'd like to progress towards. And I set these up more as goals than as the first step, because I think the steps need to be smaller and more incremental than what you see here. And then this is similarly the parent sheet, which of these, if any, are you willing to try? And they're slightly different. They're very parallel to each other. And I use them differently with different ages of children. Obviously, if you have very young children who aren't really in charge of much decision-making, if you have a 3 or a 4-year-old, you may choose only to use the parents. If you have an adolescent alone, then you may choose to only use the one for children. Any questions so far? I know it's hard. It's after lunch, and it's been a long day. So helping with goals. Make sure the goals are small and achievable, and you may need to break down those goals from the bubble sheets. Take into account the current environment and habits of every family and the cultural context. So, and I know that there's a lot of literature about this, but really taking the time to ask the family what will work for them just makes your intervention much more effective. And then emphasize that there'll be future opportunities for goal setting. There's no need to do everything at once. So again, keeping it small, keeping it simple, and keeping the number of goals limited. So here's some sample small changes, and there are numerous changes that you could try. But, replace one sweetened beverage with water every day. Choose low-calorie or diet drinks to keep at home. So just to keep it home. Fill half of your plate with vegetables at dinner. Try serving raw vegetables while meals are being prepared. Use smaller plates to control portion size. And eat breakfast every day. And if you look at these are fairly modest goals. Maybe eating breakfast every day is maybe a little bit lofty, but some of these are really, really modest goals and can be very, very challenging because you always want, or at least I always want to jump to something more ambitious. So when a kid comes in and says, I drink 7 sodas a day, it's really, really hard for me to say, just replace 1. And 6 sodas a day is like awesome, right? Because that's not exactly how I was trained. So really breaking it down small, because the more manageable you make it, the more efficacy you will have. And then so some small changes in screen time, activity, and sleep. Taking the stairs whenever possible. Doing jumping jacks during commercials. So really, really basic stuff. Not, just turn off the TV and keep it off. Just do like 5 jumping jacks during a commercial, starting really small. When parking, park further from your destination. Consider getting off at a school bus stop that's a few blocks, or where I work, an MBTA bus stop that's a little bit further from your house than the one that you normally take. Turning off the TV for just 1 hour per day. So for those families who have a preschooler at home and don't have childcare yet and may have the TV on for 12 or 14 hours a day, because that really helps them get through their day in terms of childcare. Just, hey, can you pick any 1 hour and just shut it off for that time? Not watching TV during meals. I think there's a lot of literature about that. Set a bedtime for school nights and stick to it, and then turn off the TV at night, which is a lot of the families I see go to bed with the TV on. So how many of you are familiar with SMART goals? Oh, great. Okay, so I don't even need to go through this. So SMART goals are simple, measurable, actionable, realistic, and time-bound. And I know there are many versions of SMART goals. Actually, in prep for this talk, I looked on Wikipedia to remember what all the letters were, and I guess the reason why I'm confused is because for many of these letters, there are 10 or more words that you could plug into the letter. So I chose the ones that I like the best. So I thought we'd do a small exercise together, if that sounds okay. I think we've had a lot of being talked to today, so I was hoping maybe to hear from you. So if you transform this into SMART goals, like I will eat more healthy food. So you have a family, and you ask them what they want to do, and maybe they've used a bubble sheet or something, and they say, I want to eat healthier, I want to eat more healthy foods. How can you help a family modify that into something that they may actually be able to do actionably? Does the exercise make sense? Great, go ahead.
Well, one of the things that over 7.
Okay, great. So do you do both confidence and readiness? Are you all familiar with confidence scales and readiness scales? They're motivational interviewing. I'm hearing a lot of yes, and I'm seeing some puzzledness. Is the puzzledness because you were checking your email, or is it because does anyone need a description? Would it be helpful to describe, or no, we're all okay? Yes, please. Thank you. Thank you for speaking up. I really appreciate that. So in motivational interviewing, there's a lot around understanding families or caregivers' confidence and then their readiness to make changes, right? And so this really gets to those points around self-efficacy. So often what's used is a confidence ruler, and it's essentially a 0 to 10 scale, and you ask, the family says, I'm going to take a walk. You ask them how confident they are to do that they might be able to do that, and then how ready they are. Typically, they're often used together, but it doesn't sound like you're using them together. So they tell you on a scale of 0 to 10 how confident they are. And generally, the data shows that, if they say they're a 3 in confidence, they're not going to do it. So you need to really understand their barriers and understand what would make them more confident. So the typical follow-up questions are, well, okay, if you're a 3, how would I help you get to a 5 or a 7 or even a 4? And that kind of starts a dialogue around the barriers that they have. And really, it's meant to open up this conversation. So do you okay with that?
The one thing that everyone 7,
Yeah, that's right. And getting it down to the most granular level. Yeah, I think I struggle a little bit with. I've definitely seen literature that suggests that 7 is the right number. I think as you start to have those conversations and make those goals more actionable, you'll often see a bump in your confidence scale, even within the context of that interaction. So people who start out as not people who start out as a 2, but people who start out as a 5 or a 6, you might be able to say, okay, you're going to do it before dinner on Monday, and now you say, how confident are you about that? And then suddenly they're a 7 or an 8. So that's why I struggle with the numbers a little bit. But yes, agreed. If they stay flat at 3, they're not going to do anything. That's great. And the point about asking what's lower is a very common motivational interviewing technique. But when you ask what's lower, you're actually having them understand that they already have some self-efficacy built in. I mean, if you're not a 0, you feel like you have some readiness or some ability to change. And just kind of putting those two pieces together for a family can be incredibly empowering. Great. Other thoughts about how you might transform this? And good.
You could say, I will eat 1 more vegetable per day for 1 week.
Great. And I think whenever possible, at a start time. So starting today or something. Yeah. Yeah. That's great, and it's a great teachable moment, right? Because there are occasions when someone says that they'll eat a healthy food, and you, wow, well, that's actually not healthy, or even healthier, maybe, right? So sometimes families think they're making a better choice, and they don't. So it's a nice opportunity for education. Other thoughts? That's great, and there are certainly resources from things like My Plate, which I have on one of the subsequent slides, but there's also the idea of asking, particularly in children who, may have more random eating patterns. I have a almost 4-year-old son, and what he likes does not track to what I serve at all. So, just asking what they like and generating that list for the family might be great because, as a mom, I can understand a lot of moms have no idea what their kid might be willing to eat for dinner today. Other thoughts?
On-screen
I know, right? It's an intervention in and of itself, right? That's absolutely true. That could be true. So once your goals are selected, just kind of thinking about how to reinforce the goals, and then we'll go through a little bit of action planning. Use Teach Back to have your child and family repeat the goals back to you. Are you all familiar? I mean, Teach Back is what it sounds like. You teach the family something, and you have them teach it back for you. To you, I do it on the way out of every exam room in terms of. I should say that. I should make it sound like I'm actually not trying to run out the door at the same time, but usually I am. But I do this on every exam room as I walk out the door for all things, for obesity and otherwise. I mean, I think it's really powerful to have the families tell things back to you because it's their moment to process it and to leave with it as their last nugget. And again, it's their voice, not yours. Develop a written action plan that the family can take with them. Identify community and family supports that can help family achieve their goals, and connecting families with each other whenever possible. And that can be really challenging. I know there's a lot of stigma around obesity, but just trying to find ways. I mean, things like if you were just going to do this collage exercise and open it to families with children of all weight, it might be a place where you have two 10-year-old girls who are both struggling with their weight and getting teased who might just have this natural affinity to each other. So just trying to set up those opportunities. I think I've been working in the type of setting I work in for years, but I am still struck by how little social connectivity there may be in some of these communities. And so just really trying to help build that social capital wherever possible is great. And then identify national resources to reinforce the messaging. We'll go through a little bit of that. So this is what we've done in terms of the written action plan in our Collaborate for Healthy Weight work, which is the Healthy Weight Plan. And it's an individual action plan that can be used to support healthy choices throughout a community. There are 3 goals. The first is to help individuals and families choose 1 or 2 behaviors that are important for them to change. The second is to help them develop a specific plan to make the change. The more specific the plan, the more successful, as we've just talked about. And the third is to link in supports. These could be family members, community agencies, educational resources that might support the individuals and families as they follow their plan.
I have a question. If you could expand a little bit more on the third point.
Sure.
How does that happen in practical?
Yes. If you give me 4 minutes, I'll get there. Is that okay? The healthy weight plan creation should be led by the child and family. So, it can be very challenging, particularly if you have a finite amount of time. You may be naturally inclined to really drive this, say, hey, okay, let's just print this thing out, let's click these boxes, and let's be done. But the more it's family-driven, I think the better the uptake. Like a care plan that's used in the patient center medical home, it's meant to be updated over time. So the goal, if you set a few goals one month, the hope is that you'd update them the next month. And then a healthy weight plan can be generated in any part of the community, and this is primary care, schools, community agencies, and should be shared across sites. So this, when you hear about the healthy weight plan and it sounds like a care plan, it really starts to sound very medical. And I don't think the way we've done this, it's meant to be that way at all. We have some sites where it's been generated in schools, it's been generated across types of agencies and taken around. So I think if primary care is the right place where you live, great. But if you're really motivated and you work at the Y, you can start these. I think anyone can start them. We have had a little bit of healthy discussion about whether it should be called a healthy weight plan or if it should be called a healthy lifestyle plan. I think sites have customized what they actually call it. And I think for us, it's our charge to determine whether we really want the word weight in there or not. But for right now, that's what it's called. Yeah. Yeah, so that's a great question. So I think it depends on which part you're asking about. But it could potentially happen in multiple visits. I think doing a healthy weight plan takes a little bit of time. It probably takes about 15 minutes. However, all of the things we talked about leading into the healthy weight plan were effectively the elements of the healthy weight plan, right? So, so what I did for myself, because I was struggling with needing to book 4 patients an hour in a community health center just to meet my RVUs and all those great things that happen to clinicians, I actually started a team-based model. So I started a clinic in which I also used a nutritionist and a community health worker, because that made things go a little bit better for me and allowed that time to be there. And so some parts of the healthy weight plan, that type of thing, the healthy weight plan didn't exist then when I started it, but this is the kind of stuff that would happen with a community health worker potentially and not with me. So I would say probably for all of this stuff to happen together, I think probably about 35 to 40 minutes, and that's historically. But in my setting, we did it with 3 different providers. And if you have more questions about that, I'm happy to go into that, because that made my life a lot easier and was actually pretty successful.
I just wanted to add, we don't have the ability to have multiple different people come in and provide it.
And generally, I mean, in terms of setting these goals, monthly follow-up tends to work really well. And I went through all of these tests, these small cycles where I tried to spread them out 8 weeks. I tried to spread them out every 1 week, every 2 weeks, and it seems like monthly is really kind of the easiest and seems to be manageable for families above the other times. Every family is different, so certainly even within a monthly structure, I've had families who come every 2 weeks. Great. If you're that motivated, wonderful. And then there are families who can only make it every 3 months, and that's fine too. Does that answer your question? Okay, great. Other questions? Okay. So just some essential elements of the healthy weight plan. The first is the current target behaviors. So this is reinforcement of education about best practices. So, usually it's some elements of the survey. So really, you're reinforcing this idea that, eating more fruits and vegetables is a good idea, that reducing sugar-sweetened beverages is also an evidence-based practice. The goals set, so a review of the individualized goals. The barriers, I think it's really important for families to kind of write down their barriers if they can, or for you to help them write them down. And then the specifics steps to be taken to attain those goals. So again, just breaking it down even further. And then the partners supporting the family in change. So I think this plays out in a couple of different ways. And these can be school, out of school, community, et cetera. So I think the first, those rings that Sandy was talking about earlier, the first ring of partnership is really kind of it's first the inner family, right? The family that lives together. But then often families have a very close layer of support that might be grandparents that take care of the children sometimes, or they split their time between mom and dad, so that kind of next ring. So I think the first set of partners is really who in your family or in your social network is going to support you in getting towards these goals. So maybe, grandma can watch the kids for an hour so you can go to the grocery store without the kids, so that you're not coming home with only sweetened cereal. Because every time you bring the kids, they're going to hang off of the cart and ask for the Frosted Flakes, right? So kind of helping operationalize those changes. And then the other ways in which the community partners play out is generally I have tried to maintain a list of community resources. And some of that's been done by sort of doing a scan of the environment, doing Googling essentially what's around. And then once you have a basic list, just checking in with families about how things are going. When you're in a cycle where you're doing these obesity visits, you can ask families, that's right, Jimmy plays lacrosse down on Main Street. How is that going? Are the instructors good? Do you like it? Is you running around a lot? And you kind of gather your information that way, and then continue to add to essentially a spreadsheet. And there are less complex versions. It depends on who you have available to help you. This type of resource guide is an amazing student project, right? Because the average high school kid can Google 100 times faster than I can. So, if you have that kid who wants to go into healthcare or community service and really, really, really wants something to do this summer, that's a really great way to get this done. And has worked really well for me in the past. And then the vetting ultimately is through the family. So all you need the volunteer to do is catalog the information. Does that help with your question?
So that's part of your prescription, I'm just curious. It goes with that, or you just give them some handout for that?
The resources, I generally don't. So I know a lot of practitioners who give out resource handouts or resource books. I think they're really overwhelming. I think a lot of the families that I serve don't do well with tables. That organization of information isn't necessarily intuitive to them. And I think that it can just be a lot to look through, and when you give me a list of 100 things, I'm apt to kind of just leave it on the floor of my car and get it the next time I get my car cleaned. So I think that what I do is try to work through it with the family and try to choose one, try to ask them what they're interested in. Well, I just ask them what they're interested in, and obviously I already know the age of the child. I know some things about the child going into this process. This is typically the tail end of the visit, and then I ask them what they might be interested in, and then I kind of map that to the knowledge I have, and then try and choose the resources that map and give them one or two. That's fine. And then a statement of commitment and signature. So I'm going to breeze through the last couple of slides. We do have 15 minutes built in for questions, and I know we've been doing questions all along, so we'll figure out how the timing goes. So the confidence and the readiness scale are here. They are on some of the healthy weight plans for some of the teams. There's the community messaging. So if you have a strong community message like 5210 here in Maine, that's a great place to sort of resonate or amplify that message. Emergency contacts and other contacts. In some contexts, the healthy weight plan is used in after-school programs and also includes sort of signing off on the child's health. And in that type of situation, if it's being used as that sheet, you might also want to know who to contact in case of an emergency. And so in some places, that's been used as well. And then any restrictions on activity. So similarly, if you're using this in an out-of-school program and you want that to be present, that's another thing you could add. So here are some examples. This one's from Sarasota, Florida. And it's a little bit challenging to read, but I think the slides will be available to you. And it kind of goes over what we just spoke about. Here's another example as well. And then just thinking through local partners for families. So school nurses are, and someone said they work in a school-based health center, but school nurses are great partners, out-of-school programs, recreation departments, community centers, farmers markets and community gardens. People don't always think of those as great partners for families, but I think the more, certainly I do a lot of farmers market work, or a fair amount at least. The more families show interest in those markets, the more they are willing to engage directly with the community, and the more that they'll look for ways to build systems to community build. So I think really encouraging families and making those partnerships yourselves. Faith-based groups, they might have a walk after church or things like that. Cultural groups, things like dance, and then neighborhood groups as well. And so for national partners, this list will be available to you, but there are great family resources on the Let's Move website, which is the First Lady's initiative. We Can, I showed you a little bit of that before. The CDC does a really good job of explaining BMI in simple terms and really thinking through what the different weight classifications mean. My Plate, so I think many of you know that the food pyramid has essentially been replaced by My Plate. And it has some really nice pictures and some very simple language. I mean, I struggle to find resources at a simple reading level, and My Plate does a really, really good job of that.
I have a question about
Yeah.
the My Plate. In the My Plate, they show vegetables as only 1/4 of the plate, and then we actually, if you look at your previous slide, it says half the
Yep.
plate. How are we reconciling that difference?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there are a lot of questions about how to reconcile My Plate with other, with even things like the food pyramid or with other recommendations. There's a lot of controversy around the dairy, the presence or absence of dairy. I think for me, what I try to get to with families is really small incremental change. I do set half as a goal still, even though My Plate says otherwise, but for many of the kids I see, actually, 1/4 is a perfectly reasonable goal because they're not even close to there yet. So I think I tend to be very pragmatic in my approach and say just try to go up from where you are.
Approach, show that first, then
Yeah.
move them up to half.
Yeah.
Because it's conflicting when you say something and you show them something else on the picture.
No, absolutely. And I think when there is a discrepancy and you're having maybe those two conversations in the same visit, then I tend to draw attention to the discrepancy and say, I know that this looks a little bit different than we talked about. This is the way that I would address this. Other questions? So the other things are the CDC Youth Physical Activity Toolkit for families, and then the President's Council on Physical Activity. So after the visit, just establish checkpoints with the family. Use your medical home team if you have one, right? I mean, have a medical assistant who's making some reminder calls for high-risk families. This might be a nice point of contact. Consider monthly plan visits if you can in your system. Revise the healthy weight plan monthly if you can in whatever setting you work in. Use diaries to track physical activity and dietary changes as needed. So, food diaries and physical activity diaries are really challenging, but even if you can get a one-day snapshot, it can be a big eye-opener for a lot of families to see, oh, well, I thought I had 3 meals, but I really had 3 meals and 4 snacks, and understanding what the contents of those were. And I actually have done it myself and been very surprised. Even after being trained for a long time.
About food diary.
Yeah.
Ask the family to track one day, Monday through Friday, and one weekend day, and see if they notice any differences about how their family eating style changes, because often the weekend is where things go off the rails.
Yep, I think that's completely true, and screen time as well and activity. And then coordinate with community partners to enhance support. So this is just a summary of what we went through. I think the other groups have been released, but I'll just go through this briefly. Remove stigma from the conversation, provide simple information about energy balance, use concrete examples to make education come to life, allow families to set the agenda, work together to develop SMART goals, co-create a written healthy weight plan, identify local supports for change, and then identify national supports for change. Yeah. Yeah. So there are lots of groups working on that actually around the country. Typically, they're research groups at this point. I think generally they're larger scale studies is more of what we're looking at right now, and testing different things. So testing simply the messaging around the simple kind of reduction or increasing fruits and vegetables or decreasing sweetened beverages. Others are testing more behavior change principles. And doing, kind of text and text back and seeing whether families text back. I haven't heard a lot about tweeting, actually. I know that there are some concerns around how much healthcare moves into the space of Facebook or Twitter and how that relates to privacy and other things. So, but I'm unaware of anyone who's tweeting, although someone must be, right? I mean, there's so many people in the world tweeting. Someone's got to be tweeting about this, but I haven't heard about that. But there's actually a lot about text messaging, and we can talk after if you have more specific questions around that. And that's all I have. Other questions? I know we're at time.